I'm Tony Davy. I'm an Emeritus Professor of Ecology at the University of East Anglia, and I've been Chairman of the Bergh Apton Conservation Trust now for the last 25 years. The Trust is an extremely unusual, possibly unique kind of community project. It's an area of land of some 22 acres now, which is owned by this charity, the Bergh Apton Conservation Trust, in perpetuity for the purposes of nature conservation. It was set up originally in 1994, so we've been going some 29 years now, by a group of public-spirited and forward-looking villagers who discovered that a patch of woodland up behind Bergh Apton Church was up for sale and was possibly going to be used as a rubbish dump. They clubbed together and raised enough money to buy it off the previous owners, who were Atlas Aggregates. Interestingly, it had been used as gravel workings previously, just about 4 acres there on the valley side, and the gravel from there reputedly was used to build Seething Airfield during the war. But I think gravel was last extracted about in 1970. These people got together, purchased it, and then wondered what they were going to do with it, having saved it from a possible fate. They set up the Conservation Trust charity, or the trust, and transferred the ownership to that. And then they held a public meeting to try and decide what to do about it. That was about the time I moved into the village. I went along to a public meeting and told them what they needed was a management plan. And by the end of the evening, I was one of the new trustees. And I've sort of been involved pretty much ever since. So just to take you through the actual nature reserve and the history of it. As I said, the first part was this piece of woodland on gravelly land behind the church, which we call Church Plantation, a bit over 4 acres. It's a very undulating sort of landscape, because the gravel has been excavated in sort of deep lenses, leaving the sort of sandy deposits in between. So it's got these big depressions and high points along the general slope down to the river. Historically, it would have been oak woodland. Obviously, a lot of the trees were felled during the gravel works and has been extensively colonised by sycamore. And our long-term management plan is to move it back towards oak wood, but this is clearly, a very long-term plan. But we've encouraged the oak trees. We've even planted some new ones in strategic places, and we occasionally chop down the sycamore trees when they're impeding the development of the oak trees. So we don't want to take away the woodland, but we want to gradually displace the sycamores with oaks and other traditional oak woodland species. So that's a policy that we've been carrying on with, for more than 25 years, and it's slowly working. Our second big opportunity came in 2007, when an adjacent landowner offered to sell us Valley Marsh, which is where we're sitting at the moment, which is the sort of big area of peat, tall herb marsh, just below Church Plantation. This is, I think about 5 acres. And it was sold to us by this adjacent landowner, who has always been sympathetic to the trust, and indeed at one time had been a trustee. So he very kindly offered to sell us to at an advantageous rate. If you had seen it then, you wouldn't recognise it from what we have here now. It was covered in stinging nettles, which were about shoulder height to me, and it was planted with about 70 cricket-back willows in neat rows, which were about I don't know, 60 feet high. They were certainly very over age for cricket bats, and they were there shading the ground and sucking the water out of the marsh and generally impeding the marsh. So our management plan here was to cut down the willows and to mow the nettles and other vegetation every year and take away the rakings so that new things can get established. It took us a long time, probably 10 years in total, but we have achieved that. If you were to come back here in about a month's time, it would be a blaze of colour with campions and meadowsweet and hempagrimony and even the occasional orchid, and it would be tall marsh vegetation. And the stinging nettles are now confined only to the riverbanks and a few other places. So essentially we have restored it back to lowland valley marshland, and we're very pleased. We do have other things. We have alder here, which is also a valuable reserve. We have 2 ponds, one of which was here when we bought it, and another which we have dug ourselves about 5 or 6 years ago. We have 2 big dikes that drain into the river, and various other sort of small wet patches. So what we have been aiming to do is to maximise the diversity of these habitats, different kinds of water and marsh and woodland carr as a way of diversifying and maximising the wildlife that can live here. So that was the second phase. The third and biggest phase happened only 3 years ago, when we were offered a further tranche of this land from the same local landowner, the other side of the River Chet. And this is the area that we now call Welbeck Marsh because it runs alongside Welbeck Road. And this is our biggest challenge yet. This is some 12 acres. It has old areas of marsh and dikes and quite a lot of scrub and woodland and a bit of alder carr. As with Valley Marsh, it hasn't had any management for many years. It would have been a graze marsh probably many decades ago, but it's got very sort of tall and overgrown, and many of the interesting species have sort of been struggling to survive against the tall vegetation. So our prescription is not unlike what we've been doing in Valley Marsh, except it's on a bigger scale, and although the Conservation Trust now has 108 members, not many of them are actually either able or even willing to come and do all the hard labour that's involved in cutting down trees and mowing and raking. So we're now looking for much more help and much more less labour intensive ways of managing Welbeck Marsh and bringing it into the same kind of condition or better as Valley Marsh here. The big advantage is that we have access for heavy machinery through the local farm there, which we don't have here on Valley Marsh. So last autumn another local farmer friend came with a big tractor and topper, and he actually cut 4 or 5 acres of the marsh there for us, something which we have always done with a hand scythe or a power scythe on this bit of marsh. And then that having been done, we were blessed by a big group of people from Aviva who were doing volunteering days, and 2 parties of 9 people came for 2 whole days. So we had 18 raking person days, which was just enough to rake up all of the cuttings that had been done by the tractor and topper. So we can safely say we've now actually begun the management of Welbeck Marsh, and we're looking forward to this summer to seeing if there's any sign of benefits. One autumn's management is obviously not a lot, but we're hoping we might see some improvements already. The future there is quite exciting. Obviously we could carry on with a big tractor, but we're not guaranteed to get the volunteers to rake it up, and we're looking at the possibility of management grazing on that site. Again, we have another local farmer who's interested in conservation, who is in principle willing to lend us 5 of his belted galloways to do some grazing, and we're just investigating the logistics of how would we manage this. We're not experts in animal husbandry, and neither do we really want to be responsible for the cows. But we're looking at a very modern system of collars whereby the cows are contained within a certain area by impulses that come from these collars that are actually defined by a GPS system, which tells the collars where the cows are allowed to go and where they're not to go. We have to establish that this would work for us, but we've recently been lucky to come into a little bit of unexpected funding, which would probably pay for 5 of these collars. So we're hoping we might be able to start this possibly this autumn, and definitely next year. So I think the prospect, although we've been doing this for some 29 years, I think the prospect has never really looked brighter actually. I mean, it's all looking extremely positive. So that was a brief history of Bergh Apton Conservation Trust. There's obviously an awful lot of detail that I put in. We're also a social community, and we have summer barbecues, and we have Christmas parties. We have conducted tours, we have lectures, we have an AGM where we normally have some kind of guest speaker. So for the people who are not able to come down onto the marsh, there's plenty of other things going on. We've even had some excursions further afield with a basic conservation theme, really mainly to help people understand conservation in the broader context. We tend, or at least we did pre-COVID, to go to somewhere, within East Anglia for a day trip each year, some major nature reserve or place of ecological interest. In the early days we went to Greece on one occasion, led by Laurie, who had a sister living there at the time. We had a fantastic time looking at vast numbers of orchids, and then shortly after that a similar trip to Cyprus, where we saw another lot of exciting habitats that you wouldn't be likely to see in Norfolk. So as well as our strong conservation ethos, we also are concerned to educate people in conservation and ecological matters, and especially young people. We have parties here from local schools, from cubs, brownies, beavers, rainbows, the full spectrum, and we generally are doing as much as we can to educate people about the good care of the countryside and the conservation of biodiversity. Another big recent project is something called the Chet Valley Beeline. This is something which has been going now for about 5 years, and for which we got separate funding, and which is initiated by my colleague and now fellow trustee Rodney Aldis, who you may be not hearing from. But essentially a beeline is an area, or is a linear function of habitat which allows invertebrates, especially pollinators, to be able to move about the countryside. The countryside is now so fragmented by agricultural and urban use that insects, pollinators and the like tend to be isolated in places like our nature reserve here, unable to move between them. And as the climate changes, and as pollinators become more threatened by well, not just climate change, but by pesticides and by intensification of agriculture, their only hope for survival is being able to be agile and moving about the countryside. And the whole idea of a beeline is that it facilitates this movement from one place to the next. And the idea is it should be like a sort of linear set of stepping stones where there's sort of pollinator-friendly habitat that they can move from one to another. Ideally, these would be no more than 500 metres apart, but we're pragmatists and we do it however we can. So we've been setting up this sort of local beeline that runs from Porringland in the west, some 17 kilometres along the River Chet, to close to where it joins the River Yare at Hardley. And we have as a sort of keystone to this our nature reserve, which is sort of more or less in the middle, but there are a number of important other wildlife sites along the line. There's a big area in Porringland which is going to become available, or part of it will become available for wildflower meadows and the like, because it's been donated by the house builders who are developing Porringland. But we've also had this project to engage landowners, gardeners, businesses, doctors' practices, anybody who might have an interest in wildlife. And so we've been engaging with them, inviting them to join in, to dedicate at least part of their land to pollinators, to display our logo, generally change the management of their land slightly, maybe by not cutting hedges so often, being less tidy in their gardens, allowing patches to grow up, for flowers to grow and for insects to pupate over winter and things like that. And we've been successful. We've recruited a lot of people along this 17 kilometres of the River Chet who are sympathetic and are making these small changes which are necessary. And unfortunately our separate funding for doing this has just come to an end, but we are just at the moment looking for further ways of continuing this project, because we think it's enabled us to expand from our little cornerstone here in Bergh Apton and do something which is beneficial to the whole of South Norfolk, which will link up with a national system of beelines, which is run by BugLife, the charity. So generally contribute on a much larger scale to conservation of wildlife.
My name's Bob Kerry. I'm a member of the Bergh Apton Conservation Trust. I've been a member since the very early days, and I am currently treasurer, so it's my job to look after all the finances, and being a registered charity, this can be quite complicated. But the thing I'm really known for, I suppose, is one of the organisers of our work days. With our 22 acres, there's always jobs to do, and we have 2 work days a month, one on a Saturday, the 3rd Saturday of the month, and the following Thursday. And there's always many tasks, either cutting the marshes and raking off the vegetation, clearing out the ditches, building dams, taking out trees where trees are not wanted, all sorts of various jobs. And just before the work day, the chairman, Tony, he sends an email to all our members to say what tasks are needed for that week, and hopefully we'll get a decent number of people. Sometimes it's just a few, sometimes over 10 or even 15, and that way we can get the jobs done ourselves without paying somebody to do them, which is always good, being with my treasurer's hat on. In addition to the work days, we have bigger jobs such as building bridges over the River Chet, and things like that, and cutting even larger areas of the marsh and raking off, which is always a tough job. And for that we've been encouraging businesses to run their work days here. I suppose, don't know what you'd call them really, but we've had Aviva Insurance here, and we've had Lotus, and they bring good teams, 10, 15, even more people, and they're always very committed because they're having a day out in the countryside and being paid for it. And so with a team as big as that, we can get an awful lot done. And so we have to plan these days really well to keep them all occupied as much as we can, because if you've got a big team, you don't want them sitting around drinking tea all the day, do you? Although they do that sometimes. And so that's it. Owning 22-acre nature reserve, it is a big responsibility. If we just did nothing, the nettles would grow, the brambles would grow, the trees would grow, and we'd end up with pretty much a very overgrown woodland area which nobody could visit.
I'm Linda Davy. I'm a member of the Bergh Apton Conservation Trust. I'm not able to do a lot physically on the work days, but membership of the trust is also more than just the physical side. There is a great camaraderie and social side, as well as educational side to being a member. We have good social events like summer barbecue, not on the trust, in the chairman's garden. We have a Christmas party, we have outings, but we also just enjoy talking to each other, exchanging ideas. The Conservation Trust area is a wonderful place just to either come on work days and sit, or generally. It's open to the public, it's open access. Dogs are encouraged, so long as they're kept on lead. And people, particularly during the pandemic, found it very restful to be able to come and sit and just be away from the general hubbub of life. And these open spaces are very important for us all. And if we can all do our little bit, either as physical workers or as supporting as members, because the more members we have, the more easier it is to get grants and support from other bodies, then that will help conservation in Bergh Apton, but also conservation generally, and the species diversity of this area and generally of the planet. If you'd like to get involved, you could look on our website, Bergh Apton Conservation Trust. We also have a Facebook page. The chairman and secretary and treasurer are all the contact details there. So please feel free to contact us. There are also contact details on the parish magazine.
Okay, well, projects like ours are very important because they complement things that are able to be done by the statutory authorities, I would say. We have an important national organisation called Natural England, which manages the best sites we have in the country. We have local county wildlife trusts which manage a lot more, and we have various other organisations whose rationale is to conserve and manage, but this still covers a tiny proportion of the countryside in this country, and the only way in which we're going to be able to establish big enough networks of nature reserve is if we conserve a lot of sites which are not of the highest conservation importance, but which are nevertheless important, like the one we have here. So this is, I think, where charities like the Bergh Apton Conservation Trust come in. We have the ability to, in this case, own and manage 22 acres, which nobody else would have the capacity to do that. And so, if you like, we're sort of filling in patches in the countryside between the big, major, important national nature reserves and places like that. So that's the sort of organisational rationale for what we do. On a bigger scale, it's quite clear that nature conservation and the maintenance of wildlife is ever more important. I mean, everybody's heard all of the horrible statistics that have been coming about how many species that we've lost, how much natural habitat we've lost. We've lost nearly all our natural meadows now. Many species of all kinds are down to a tiny proportion of what they were even 50 years ago. And so, with fragmentation of the habitats, with increasing use of pesticides, increasing use of other chemicals, fragmentation of the habitat, climate change, which is superimposed on the whole of this, meaning that everything is changing. The need for nature conservation has never ever been higher. The more people who we can get to commit to it, the better. So as well as the actual practical conservation of what we're doing here, we're trying to convert people to understand the need for it, to understand the joy of doing it, and to actually come and get their hands dirty in doing it. My own interest in ecology is scientific. Starting out with doing a PhD some 50 years ago, and then for many years after that working as a lecturer and then professor at UEA in ecology. So again, that has involved training many hundreds of people to become ecologists, and many of those are now working in conservation and other areas as of practical ecology. But having said that, I've been interested in natural history ever since I was a child, and my entry into this was essentially through flowers. I've always been interested in wildflowers, and basically what has happened after that, I've been paid for being interested in wildflowers for about 50 years, and I suppose not all people are that lucky. I think that's the end of that segment.